Muy buenos días, tengan todos. Muchas gracias por seguirnos en este segundo Foro Internacional de la
Good morning,
Innovación
everyone.
en la
Thank you for following
Justicia,
us in this
organizado
second
por México
international forum
Evalúa y la
on
Fundación
justice
Friedrich Naumann.
innovation organized by Mexico
Agradecemos
Evalúa
a todos los que
and
nos siguen
Frederick Naumann
acompañando y
Foundation. I
por
would like to
favor
thank everyone who is
síganos en
still with
nuestras redes
us,
sociales de México
and please
Evalúa,
follow us
igual
on
en
our
nuestra página
social
de YouTube.
media in Mexico
En este
Evalúa and
segundo
our
día del
YouTube
Foro
channel.
Internacional de Innovación en la
This is the second
Justicia,
day of this
estaremos discutiendo
forum
y
on justice
analizando las
innovation, and we
diferentes
will be
formas en las
discussing
que
and
la
analyzing the
tecnología y la
different ways
innovación
in which
pueden facilitar el
technology
acceso a la
and
justicia.
innovation can
En
facilitate
este primer
access to
panel
justice. In this
platicaremos de la
first
justicia
panel, we
global,
will talk
cómo
about
garantizar el
global
acceso a la
justice and how
justicia
to
ante las
guarantee access to
desigualdades y la
justice
migración.
before
Nos
inequality and
acompañan
migration.
Alberto Pradrilla, de
We
Animal
have Alberto
Político,
Pradrilla from
como
Animal
moderador,
Político
Laura
as our
Susan
facilitator,
Golesorki,
Lara
fundadora y
Susan
directora
Golesorki,
ejecutiva
who is
del
the
Centro
founder
para la
and
Migración,
CEO for
Género
the
y
Center for
Justicia,
Migration,
y
Gender,
Felipe
and
González
Justice,
Morales,
and Felipe
de las
González
Naciones Unidas
Morales
sobre los Derechos
from
Humanos de los
UN
Migrantes.
for Human Rights
Muchísimas
for
gracias.
Migrants.
Muy buen día.
Thank you very much and have a great day. Hello, good morning, and thank you for being with us. Today, we will be talking about access to justice and migration in a context of great difficulties, both here in Mexico and in the whole region. We need to consider that the last few years have been of really harsh policies against migrant populations, both here in Mexico and in the whole region, but we may consider the agreements between Mexico and the United States to stop the flow of migrants from the previous administration in the US and the current administration as well. Just to give you some information, in September, there were more than 41,000 people arrested here in Mexico because they were in irregular conditions as migrants. This is the highest figure we have had in the history since we have these records, which allows us to see that currently we have this policy of stopping the movement of people that are running away from violence, poverty, or other elements such as climate change, maybe, that has affected some areas in Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. These policies for stopping migration may bring severe violations to human rights for those people who are in movement. And we may remember a few months ago how people that were in the different caravans in Chiapas were victims of different law enforcement officers that were beating up these migrants. We saw these images of these people, and there were a lot of violations to human rights that is within this context of mobility of migrants. And sometimes they do not have access to justice and without access to human rights. Just this year in Mexico, we have had two events that have been severe violations to the human rights of migrants, such as the Camargo Massacre in January, in which 19 people lost their lives, 2 Mexican people, and all the rest of them were from Central America. And there is a great difficulty for the families of these migrant people that were about to reach the United States when they were slaughtered. And we have 12 police officers that are arrested. These families not necessarily have access to justice and to the information of what was happening because of the obstacles that the justice system is placing. The same thing happened recently when this Cuban migrant, Cristobal, died, killed by an element of the National Guard in Chiapas when he was in a vehicle in Vijijiapan. Once again, for his family, it's being very difficult to have access to justice and also having the certainty of being able to recognize the body and having access or to recover the body or making the procedures that are necessary in this unfortunate situation. and also to talk about the justice and migration issues, also about the impact that the new technologies have in this context. We have a panel with Felipe González Morales and Susan Olescorgi. Lara Susan is going to tell us. She is an assistant professor of political sciences and co-director of the program of gender studies of women and sexuality in the University of Portland in the US. Her line of work is in topics related to intersection, migration, and gender in a global context. Her last papers were on the protection and also for Muslim women that are facing this question, European identity, nationalism, and women in the situation in Venezuela. This is about the efforts of the civil society and also the role of the UN in ideas for peace. She is also the founder, the CEO, and promotion director of the Center for Migration in Gender and Justice. This is an NGO and a nonprofit organization that is in charge of migrants, gender, through research and promotion of information. And she was also the facilitator in a forum of equality from the UN, and she has been part of leadership programs from the Center for Migration and Justice that trains young migrants against gender violence. With no further comments, I will give her the floor, so we allow her to start this panel. Thank you very much for your participation, and the microphone is yours.
Thank you very much for having me and for providing a platform to share my work. I'm Dr. Lara Susan Golosorki, Assistant Professor of Political Science and Global Affairs, Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies, as was just mentioned, as well as the founder, Executive Director, and Advocacy Director at the Center for Migration, Gender and Justice, a nonprofit that addresses human rights at the intersection of migration and gender. I'm honored to address pressing questions on matters of justice in the context of migration among such esteemed panelists. As a migrant woman myself, coming from a family that has been displaced over space and time, matters of justice are imperative to my being, to my work as a scholar, as an educator, and also in my work as an activist. So for today's discussion, I would like to speak to the intersection of migration and gender and how matters of justice, or maybe more so injustice, operate within that. Next slide, please. So when we speak in matters of justice in the context of migration and gender, it is important to acknowledge the varied experiences that exist at this intersection. And so this includes justice for regular migrants, irregular migrants, asylum seekers, refugees, displaced persons, justice for women, justice for girls, for LGBTQIA+ persons, and for gender diverse persons. Next slide, please. Or in other words, we can speak of justice for all that experience injustices at the intersection of migration and gender. And so in this way, the vision of gender justice beyond borders means also gender justice beyond binaries. But unfortunately, gender justice beyond borders remains a goal yet to be achieved. Women, girl, LGBTQIA+, and gender diverse migrants are at heightened risk of violence, vulnerability, and marginalization, and they face specific challenges along migratory routes and in destination countries. And so these heightened risks and specific challenges speak to matters of justice in varied ways as injustices prevail. And so indeed, it was this lack of justice in the context of migration as it pertains to gender dynamics that led to the launch of the Center for Migration, Gender and Justice on International Women's Day in 2020, so at the cusp of the beginning of the pandemic. Next slide, please. So CMGJ, or the Center for Migration, Gender and Justice, is a nonprofit NGO that addresses human rights at the intersection of migration and gender through research, advocacy, and education. And in our research, we explore the specific needs and challenges of women, girl, LGBTQIA+, and gender diverse migrants. And we provide recommendations and guidance for key stakeholders about human rights at this intersection of migration and gender. In our advocacy work, we shrink spaces between migrant communities and governing bodies in order to ensure shared agency, representation, and accountability in protecting human rights for all. And in our education work, we bring together migrant communities, non-state actors, and state actors to learn with and from each other about migration and gender, notably, for instance, in our Migrant Youth Leadership Program, for instance. And so while there are many projects that I could speak to today that exemplify this important interplay between research, advocacy, and education to achieve gender justice beyond borders, for today's discussion and addressing some of the guiding questions for this panel, I would like to highlight our ongoing Spotlight project, Migration, Gender, and COVID-19. This project included ethnographic research, so interviews and observations on COVID-19's impact on refugee women's livelihoods in Portland, Oregon. It also included advocacy at various international high-level meetings, as well as speaking to our education dimension, offering English language classes online by one of our colleagues, Jen Ayers, a certified ESL teacher. But for today, I would like to focus on the research component of the project, which of course also informed the advocacy and education dimensions. So between May and July 2020, myself and CMGJ researchers Grace Fordson, Catherine Harder, and Trevor Reitman conducted interviews and observations on COVID-19's impact on refugee women's livelihoods in Portland, Oregon. And preliminary findings from our work have been published already, and some are forthcoming. And this work is ongoing. It emerged as a community-based and immersive practice. And so we're still working on various aspects thereof and have since then also expanded this very localized space within which our research findings are located. And that's what I would like to do for today in this discussion, is to connect these localized community-based efforts to broader dynamics regarding migration, gender, and justice. And the framework for my presentation concerns access to social protections by refugee women specifically, but also migrants more broadly. And so here's what we found and what we did and why. The COVID-19 pandemic and corresponding response measures have impacted communities across the world. And some communities have been particularly affected, while at the same time they have been left out of national response measures. And this is the case for many migrant communities, including refugees and asylum seekers. And so to highlight the specific challenges and needs that migrant communities face during the pandemic, we interviewed refugee women and representatives from organizations working in the context of migration. And we complemented these interviews with online observations of community efforts that provide essential services to refugees. Our research again took place in the summer of 2020 and resulted in findings that point to the importance of providing social protections for all, irrespective of migration status. Our findings show that COVID-19's impact on refugee women's livelihoods operates along three key dynamics: restricted access to resources and services, lack of information about resources and services, and fear due to ever-changing policy. And of course, this is very specific also to the United States. So from losing jobs, and with that, often losing healthcare, to becoming essential workers and to finding oneself again in unprecedented situations of limited mobility, refugee women in Portland have been confronted with concerns about sustaining their livelihoods. And in many ways, community efforts have, at the very least, complemented national COVID-19 responses and measures. Next slide, please. And so while there's much to be said about the specific challenges that refugee women have faced as it pertains to restricted access to resources and services, lack of information about resources and services, and fear due to ever-changing policy, all three dynamics are, of course, interconnected. And if we could go to the next slide, there's a quote by a Bhutanese refugee woman that we spoke to, which speaks to the urgency for justice in the context of migration and gender. The woman had been employed as a housekeeper but due to the hotel industry being severely impacted by the pandemic, she had been out of work for 3 months. And the woman described the toll that her unemployment had on her family as quote unquote manageable, and that she doesn't have time to be scared of COVID. Next slide, please. So this quote really pressingly reflects not only the implications of COVID-19 on migrant livelihoods more broadly, but also explicitly conveys the gendered dynamics within them. But then what can we do with these community-based findings, these localized research findings, and how do they relate to broader global discussions around this? Based on our empirical data and our discussion of social protections, we outline several global outlooks that capture short-term and long-term gendered implications of the pandemic in the context of migration. Next slide, please. So these global outlooks involve the inclusion of refugees and migrants more broadly in national COVID-19 response measures, the development of universal protection structures, social protection structures, as well as the implementation of gendered and intersectional approaches in migration research and politics. According to the IOM, the inclusion of refugees in national COVID-19 response plans and the development of universal social protection structures can diminish varied inequities, such as the ones found in our research in terms of access to resources and services and lack of information thereof. Indeed, we argue that these dynamics are interconnected, and so must be the efforts that seek to ensure refugee women's livelihoods. And also in providing outlooks to ensure refugee women's livelihoods during the pandemic and beyond, we also find it imperative to address the lack of gendered and intersectional approaches in migration research and politics. And this is the case for knowledge production, so data collection and analysis, as well as gender responsiveness in policy. So we suggest that gender must be embedded in the planning, in the implementation, and the evaluation of policy that governs the lives of refugee women or migrants more broadly. And we use the rhetoric of migration politics as it spans across policy fields. So not just focus on migration policy, but also social protection policy, labor policy, because migrants operate within these spaces beyond what's specific to their migration status. So just allow me to conclude here by emphasizing that our research points to significant gaps between policy and lived experiences. And we find that these gaps are mismatches in the ways that restricted access to resources and services, lack of information about resources and services, and fear due to ever-changing policy have impacted refugee women's livelihoods. And while these impacts have, of course, been heightened during the pandemic, the severity thereof suggests that existing national social protection structures have shaped and will continue to shape refugee women's livelihoods beyond the pandemic. So this said, we contend that any efforts in ensuring refugee women's livelihoods must not start and end with COVID-19 responses and measures, but that they necessitate really a rethinking of how social protection structures impact refugee women and migrant communities more broadly. Next slide, please. And with this, I say thank you and would like to extend an invitation for collaboration and an invitation to one of our upcoming events, Youth Perspectives on Migration, Revisiting the Istanbul Convention, which was organized through the earlier mentioned Migrant Youth Leadership Program. So we hope to see you there. Thank you.
Sin micrófono.
Ay, muchas gracias y disculpen.
I apologize. Thank you very much.
Y bueno, como decía, pues muchas gracias por la
As I was trying to say, thank you very much for your presentation.
Y que ahora es turno de Felipe González Morales.
And now we're going to give the floor to Felipe González Morales. He is a special rapporteur from the UN on human rights for migrants. He is also a professor of international law in the University of Santiago de Chile, where he teaches in the master's degree in human rights, and he also talks about migrants, the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, and he was president of that commission in 2015. He's also professor of the different postgraduate programs and in different universities in Spain. Since 2001, he's also professor of the American University of Washington, D.C. He is founder and first director of the Center of Human Rights in the University of Portales, and he's also part of the Latin American network of judicial networks in human rights. He has a master's degree in human rights by University Carlos III. Dr. Felipe, the floor is yours. Thank you very much for being here with us. Your time starts now. Thank you very much. Good afternoon and good morning. Thank you very much for this invitation to this forum on justice innovation. The topic of access to justice for migrant people is a key topic for the exercise of human rights in this group. We have been working in this topic as one of the core topics in our work. 3 years ago, we presented a report on access to justice for migrant people to the General Assembly of the United Nations. And in different topics and in different countries, we have been addressing this topic as well, with the objective of reaching certain aspects and groups. In two reports related to what Lara Susan was saying, two reports on gender and presented by my group 2 years ago from before the Board of Human Rights and the organization, we were talking about access to justice for migrant women. And also last year, there was a report on the migration for children, and they were also analyzing the topic of access to justice, in this case for migrant children. The main thing here is that access to justice is a basic human right for the exercise of other human rights. When we do not have access to justice, the possibility of exercising the other rights is limited. And this is also related to the case of the group of migrant people that, because of their own characteristics and based on migration policies that are in most of the states, are delegated to a secondary part, and they do not have the attention in public policies. And that's why it's very important that these people, the migrant people, are able to have access to it. When we talk about access to justice, we are not only talking about access to the judicial access itself. And I say this because in the case of the migrant group, access to the procedures and the possibility of doing these procedures judicially is very important. It's usually more important than for the people who live in that area, in that territory. For instance, in the process of deporting, these are administrative procedures, and they should have the possibility of having access to a judicial system, which is not always acknowledged by the states according to the international standards. But the possibility of having this legal situation should go through all this deporting process, both in the administration part and in the judicial part. And this can also show what we talk about, the right of seeking for asylum and for being a refugee, and also the probability of obtaining the acknowledgement of being a refugee or an asylum seeker increases 3 or 4 times when you have this legal representation. A person that has a lawyer has more probabilities of acquiring the status of refugee. And this is not just casually. This is done because of the agility in which the procedure is done, because this person has access to these procedures, to doing all the steps. And this happens as well with the migration status. At least in the Occidental countries, the decision is not based on the criminal considerations. And talking about removing this criminal classification, it was replaced by an extensive practice of the migration arrest. So in the case of Mexico,
Alberto, hay un problema ahí con... ¿Podemos hablar?
Sí, sí, sí.
Alberto, there is a problem. Yes, we believe there was a problem with his connection, right? Okay, maybe in the meantime, while we recover our communication with Dr. Felipe, maybe we can continue in some sort of interview format, which would be the most appropriate thing to do right now while we recover his connection. And you mentioned about your research and your studies based on gender. And I don't know if currently in this context, in which it seems to be more mobility and more interest from the states in not allowing this mobility and not allowing people to reach their destination, which could be the US or Europe. I don't know if from a gender perspective, we are finding greater challenges or greater violations to human rights or greater obstacles for women that find the obligation of being on the route and moving in order to reach a better life in another destination.
Yes, thank you for bringing up this very important point.
Este punto tan importante, creo que
as mentioned in my presentation, women, girls, LGBTQIA+, and gender diverse migrants face very specific challenges. And one of those to be mentioned that is particularly pressing is gender-based violence. Gender-based violence is not only a cause for migration or for flight, but it also, of course, unfortunately, it also occurs along migratory routes. And so given the frameworks that currently exist with regards to gender-based violence as a ground for seeking asylum, they're very fragmented. So this would be certainly something that I would argue from a human rights perspective needs to be solidified further. There are guidelines by the UNHCR in terms of how to address GBV prevention, mitigation, and response. But of course, each individual country responds to this differently and has different asylum laws as it concerns gender-based violence as a ground for asylum. So this is something that I think certainly needs to be further discussed and further explored and solidified within the legal institutional framework.
Uh-huh. Oye, y en este punto, sí, en este punto, ¿crees que la tecnología ha habido algún elemento?
Do you think that with technology there have been some elements? Oh, okay. We have Mr. Felipe Gonzalez back. His connection is back. We're going back with him. We are going to give him the floor again, and then we can continue talking among the three of us when he finishes his presentation. Thank you.
Se me cortó la conexión a internet.
I apologize. I lost my internet connection. I was explaining the importance of access to justice and also in the administration part for migrants. In this regard, I meant the seek of asylum, the migration situation, the process of deporting, and I would add also the process of being regular or having a better status. As you can see, there are different possibilities of having legal representation and being represented by an attorney. That is more important than in the average cases some of the people that are in different territories.
However, the question must not be restricted only to the administrative field. And here, this is not about, as it happens in many countries, where migrant people only have right to public defense in case they are accused of any crimes. They should have the possibility to obtain a legal defense also for their migration affairs before the court. And usually, I would say once the matter has gone through the administrative part. And the second point, which is important, concerns the consulate. It's a human right to have a right to this assistance, and it's part of justice access in a clear way for over 20 years now. The different international organizations like the International Court of Justice, the Inter-American Court of Rights, and other organizations have established that this is a human right, and not as it was understood before, as the right of a state face to another one, in such a way that when a migrant person is subject to a process, they have to be notified and not their origin state and about their right to obtain consular assistance, because they are fleeing the country, and it's a human right consisting in the possibility for this person to opt for this consular assistance. And we must have a system as well to provide that consular assistance for that right not to be void or something abstract in nature. This is a matter that we have been highlighting. We want states to strengthen their consular assistance mechanisms. It has happened to me as a United Nations rapporteur, and before that of the Inter-American Court, and I have been approached for assistance in terms of migration affairs. It's been the case for several countries in Mexico, in Central America, and other countries in America. This is important. This is a work that concerns not only specific cases, but also the monitoring of migrant human rights. And it's important for consuls to deal with this. There's a specific aspect which is very important, and that's for working migrant women. And migrant women working as domestic assistants, and oftentimes this work is outside the general labor regulation and not just from the legal point of view. In here, the situation places them in a marginalization, and not only economic, if there is no proactive activity by consulates for them to denounce the facts to which they are subject. It's very important for consuls to pay special attention to this collective, even more when we have a kafala system in countries like most Middle East countries in which the employer, the household owner, has the passport and the documentation, and in the end, becomes a proxy for this maintenance of the person working at the home. All of these are relevant aspects to be considered. Another important point is the one firewalls. The sanctuary cities, as they are called in America, the establishment of a strong division between access to justice and other public services on the one hand, and migration offices, and in general, the agencies, enforcement agencies on the other hand. Why is this important? Well, we can exemplify this in the context of this pandemic. In most countries, during the pandemic, at least at the normative level, it has been established that migrant people have a right to go to hospitals to receive COVID-19 assistance and health care, and to have access to vaccines. I say a declarative or normative way because in practice, most people don't go to hospitals only in cases of emergencies or life-threatening situations because they are afraid to be detained and deported. Actually, we were seeing this last year in the Dominican Republic, in which several Haitian women, pregnant Haitian women, have been deported, which went to the hospital and were detained there or upon their coming out. So what's the message being sent or conveyed to migrants? It's don't go to hospitals, otherwise you're going to be deported. And we saw this with the courts. If there is no clear barrier between the judicial and the firewall, the migration firewall and law enforcement systems, the migration agencies, the person will not go to court, or they will go only in extremis. When the crucial time has come and passed by, it's a vicious cycle that violates the migrants' human rights because they know, because perpetrators know that the person will not seek the court's assistance because they are afraid of being deported. And we are making this call from the rapporteurship so we can establish this type of strict division between the public services, including the judicial system, and the migration agencies. In this logic, we have then cities with these systems and not the state as a whole. The discussion in the United States during Donald Trump's administration was about those cities not sharing this information. San Francisco, Los Angeles, California as a sanctuary state, so to speak, Houston, Austin, New York, and in general most cities in which we have a significant migrant population. However, as you understand, the topic is not enough when we speak about city, because then the city can act as was happening during Donald Trump's administration. Some financial administrations were being made to restrain or to subtract federal financial resources to stop this firewall actions. In Mexico, what we have is temporary visas for migrant people who have been victims of some crimes. And in the case of Mexico, migrant women who have been subject to gender violence, as far as I am concerned, they are given a temporary visa so they can denounce the cases of which they have been subject without fear to be deported. This is a basic action that should be replicated by other states. Another relevant point concerns the right to an interpreter, and this may concern the language, the official language of the origin of the migrants' origin. A state or this concerns in the case of Latin America, indigenous languages. Regardless, this language is acknowledged or not in the origin country. If that migrant indigenous person does not understand what is being indicated in judicial formality, they have got a right to an interpreter, and it has been established regionally by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights and other agencies globally. I would like to highlight the relevance of judges to be the ones intervening in the protection of the human rights of migrants. Because of the characteristics, we have administrative cases, but before any deportation, assistance has to be provided, otherwise it makes no sense. And we have a kind of broad systems in this sense. We apologize, we have lost audio in the booth. We have hybrid systems where we do not have a judicial system judges. We have the Attorney General's office, and they do not belong to the system. I was seeing some recent studies in which an important percentage, about 40% of migrant judges named in the United States during the last two administrations had as last employers ICE and other law enforcement agencies. So in here we have a matter of judicial impartiality. We have to emphasize here the prioritization of judicial management and the possibility to appeal any administrative nature decisions. I would like to go back to the matter of the gender perspective for migration and access to justice. In this sense, all the judicial system with relation to migrants has to have a gender perspective, and we need specialization for the assistance of specific migrant women needs, and we should not use the same approach for everything. That's why I was mentioning the temporary visa example for women who have been subject to crime. This is a matter that we are considering from the reportership that has been strengthened, and that's the impact of migration, and the acknowledge the approach, the gender approach of migration. The old mechanisms were not there. I think this is an important step. So the Global Migration Pact, adopted by all of the Latin American countries except Chile, my country, and the Dominican Republic. I think this contributes to emphasizing. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you for your contribution and what we were saying before in terms of access to justice. I would like to ask Dr. Susan whether there are some cases or some successful practices because we're speaking about the institutions, the duties, and the things that cannot be improved. However, there are also successful practices that can be common and can be used by for other institutions to learn how to approach the question in a better way. I don't know whether you've got any examples about this to put at the table for other institutions to adopt it.
For the question.
Muchas gracias por la pregunta.
Identificar
buenas
context is always very tricky because, of course, we're also talking about individual cases or so. I think what I would say is pointing to the increased attention that has been paid on the international level when it comes to gender-based violence, particularly in context of forced migration. Last year, the UNHCR issued a new guidelines and policy practices with regards to this, specifically to gender-based violence mitigation and prevention. And so it's now up to the individual states and also other stakeholders to, of course, take these guidelines and this expertise into consideration as they move into court cases or otherwise any kind of judicial processes when it comes to gender-based violence. I think one other aspect that I would mention here, as Dr. Felipe González Morales mentioned, is also the Global Compact on Refugees, the Global Compact on Migration, but specifically in the context of gender is the newly formed Women, Peace and Security Humanitarian Action Compact, which combines concerns about women, peace and security, which of course gender-based violence is a key aspect, with humanitarian action. And so the idea here is, and this is something that I think is important to consider, is that these experiences, gendered experiences or otherwise, they occur along a continuum. They don't stop in one aspect of the migration process, right? So we're talking here about experiences in the country of origin, experiences along migratory routes, and then also experiences in destination countries. And thinking about gender-based violence and the prevention thereof and the mitigation and response thereof across these different experiences, rather than operating within policy silos. I think that this is a good practice that we keep seeing emerging more and more, that we're coupling or that we're connecting different compacts, different policy frameworks with each other, that then show that we're understanding that these experiences operate along a continuum, and that support, access to resources needs to be provided along these different aspects and along this continuum. Thank you.
Sí, quizás ahora ya sería para los dos seguir con la dinámica de ir preguntando.
For both of you, I would like to answer, and you can choose who would like to answer first. When we are speaking about innovation and access to rights, well, in case of belligerence towards migrants and an attempt of countries to prevent their crossing of borders, is there a risk that acquired human rights may be lost? So rights that we were taking for granted may be lost. And I'm thinking about here political practices such as MPP or Quédate en México, stay in Mexico, possible translation, and this is suspended now, but it was there for 2 years ago. That is not something that does not legalize the express the position out of the border. We are in a context in which a conjuncture can lead to the loss of previously acquired judicial rights, and the floor is up to anyone who would like to answer first. If you allow me, effectively, I would like, as Alberto, you were saying, there is a series of rights that have been kind of diffused derogated in the last years. And I would say that this inscribes within a context in which there is an important tension of security approach and human rights approach in the migration policies. This is reflected in the discussion on the Global Migration Pact, which is reflected in the international debate between states. This is an outstanding matter at international fora, even if the Human Rights International Fora response is clear. Their protection has to remain and prevail, but this is only focused on some rights that concern the life and integrity of people, and this has to be interpreted in a contextualized way. And the examples by Chapter 2 and the Remain in Mexico policy are coherent to this volatility of the migration policies, and this is a common trait to all the world regions. For instance, in the case of South America, we can see how in a very short period, most times almost all South American states have completely changed their migration policy. And in 2018, that's only 3 years ago, they established the Quito process for the Venezuelan displacement in a perspective that was of welcoming. However, it became a series of obstacles to prevent Venezuelan displacements to other countries, and definitely this has increased human trafficking levels. It is believed that there is effectively a reduction in human rights. Now, if we connect this to this panel's topic, I think that we have the challenge here to strengthen access to justice, and things have been obtained. I think the civil society has achieved things in this sense. When we have the public defender offices, autonomous agencies within the state machine that that manage to protect the migrants' human rights. Of course, when legislation is changing, this is more difficult to achieve, but a judge can always interpret legal norms according to human rights, international law, or the Constitution itself, guaranteeing these rights. I think this is very important in the pandemic context. We have had some interesting examples in which the Latin American context, and I'm speaking about the state courts besides the Inter-American Court, of course, and these courts have halted any extreme exception measures adopted in the pandemic context that affect migrant people. We have just 5-6 minutes now left, but I don't know if you would like to add, Lara Susan, I don't know if you would like to add something about this.
Yes, if I may, I'll be very brief. And
Sí, voy a ser muy.
Maybe one way that I can contribute here is to think about access to human rights more broadly, outside of also the judicial system and migration policy per se. Some of my research most recently, and actually this is part of a research collective on gendered implications on COVID-19's impact during the pandemic, as by the IOM that I'm working on, and I'm contributing a chapter to, is on the right to health for instance, and particularly the right to or access to mental health resources and services. And so, of course, each country itself has particular restrictions with regards to this. Some countries are more open or less restrictive in terms of access to health services by non-citizens, while others are very restrictive. Where in other countries we see it being more restrictive in this case. And I think this is something, of course, to consider, particularly during this pandemic, but also beyond, when we're speaking of mental health resources and services and who has access to them in the context of forced migration. So I did a comparative case study analysis between different countries, and the gendered implications, of course, of mental health are different, and they exhibit or manifest in varied ways. So I think that is, and we can, of course, talk about different areas of human rights as well, but I really wanted to stress here, of course, the importance of health during the pandemic, and particularly mental health as it concerns gendered components. Thank you.
Si puedo comentar sobre eso. Sí, ahí, bueno, me parece muy interesante lo que plantea Lara Susan y que esté
I think
desarrollando.
what Susan was saying is very interesting. This is a topic that was addressed by the Special Rapporteur of the United Nations 3 years ago in terms of access to mental health for the migrant population. I think it's a crucial topic, and of course, in the pandemic context, has become more necessary to address. In here, I would say that we have several hypotheses. First of all, the migrant population can only have access to health services in emergency cases. Others consider this in a broader way. I think that the pandemic context has broadened this perspective. However, I would like to highlight that this is not a matter of regulations. And that's what I meant with firewalls. The person gets there, and at the hospital that they're going to call, look, we have an undocumented person, they're going to call the migration service, and the person is going to say, their country fellows are going to say, like, don't go to the hospital because you're going to get reported. And the other topic here is that what's an emergency? What's emergency here? Because we're speaking about emergency healthcare because of an accident, a person who was healthy and undergone a serious accident. Okay, but there are people who go to migrant people who go to the ER because they are there because they did not receive a timely healthcare, like a chronic disease, for instance. So the problem becomes an emergency because of that lack of access to healthcare under ordinary circumstances. Okay, we have come to the end of this panel, and I know that we would have loved to discuss many more things, but we are running out of time. So I would like to ask each one of you to close in a minute what you think that the main message to convey should be after this discussion we have had. What do you think should be the keys, the outstanding keys? I'm going to give you 1 minute for closing to each. To close our panel, Lara Susan, I'm going to give you the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This is very difficult to do in 1 minute because unfortunately, so many injustices prevail. But I will do my best, at least speaking from it through a gendered perspective. I think, and this was reiterated several times throughout the discussion, is that we have to consider that migrant experiences vary. There is no one uniform experience that exists. And with that, of course, access to justice and questions of justice need to be responsive, particularly to these experiences. And when looking at this through a gender perspective, a lot of times the frameworks that exist for protection or access are very broad. They don't particularly look into gender dimensions within access to health, for instance. Does this include maternal health, etc., reproductive health, right? So just to give some examples here where I think the general broader approach where we're moving towards to with, for instance, the Global Compact on Migration and the Global Compact for Refugees, we see a more human rights oriented approach there. What is still needed is to really consider the specific experiences and the intersectional experiences that migrants, of course, carry. Thank you so much.
Tu turno, por favor.
Felipe, your turn. I think that we have lost Felipe again. No, he's there. I would like to signal a specific point. We apologize, we have lost audio in the booth. I think Felipe is having connection problems again. The relevant audio quality is bad in the booth. We apologize. I think the state I'm not sure if you were able to listen to all of my contribution, but that was the message I wanted to convey. Thank you very much, both of you. It's been a pleasure to have you with us. It's been important to speak about the current difficulties experienced by displaced people to have access to justice services and the challenges for the latter, for migrants to have access to them, not just in terms of transit, as I was mentioning at first, but also when migrants get to the destination place, that place they were expecting to get to, and all of those difficulties, as it was mentioned by our two speakers. We have the example of COVID-19 and how about the difficulties to get access to health in the last year and a half of a terrible pandemic that we have undergone. We have seen the relevance of the civil society as agents for accompanying and supporting migrants, and likewise somehow to force institutions to guarantee a series of rights that are not always guaranteed, especially in a border externalization context, in a context in which governments try to prevent the transit of displaced people, and ever more people are on the move trying to get to a better life or to save their lives. And in here we also have the difficulties encountered by the moving people in terms of rights guarantee, as can be right to asylum, that has been questioned in the last times, especially with xenophobic policies and rights reduction like those practiced by former American President Donald Trump. So this has been a very interesting discussion, and there are many outstanding topics about which to discuss. We have the role of the civil society or of new technologies that could have been there. Those are the outstanding elements that we could explore in the future. I want to thank the speakers and the guests for having been with us this morning. I want to thank the public for following us. Lara, Susan, Golisoki, thank you for having been with us. Felipe Gonzalez Morales, thank you very much for your participation. And I invite you to continue with us for the next panels of this forum. Thank you very much. Thank you for this discussion and have a great day.